Hello and welcome along to the latest episode of the Manchester is Red podcast. Myself, George Smith, and my colleague and our Chief United writer, Samuel Luckhurst. We're going to look back today on United's 4-0 win over Everton at Old Trafford on Sunday lunchtime and look ahead to Wednesday's trip to the Emirates to face Arsenal. Samuel, as ever, you were inside Old Trafford yesterday for that victory. And for once, quite a relaxing afternoon at the office for United, a convincing home win for once.
Apart from the Barnsley game earlier this season, but that feels very different given the context of a League Cup tie. But as you kind of alluded to, it was the first time they've won, excuse me, by a 4-goal margin in the league since the opening day of the 2021-22 season. Which you don't want to get too ahead of yourself, but when that happens in the new manager's first home league game in charge, that is very much a positive sign. It was a peculiar match in that it seemed to be spread over, as all matches are, they're spread over 3/3, but this one was almost compartmentalised quite neatly in 3/3, and that Everton were the better team in the first half an hour, and so much so that Ruben Amorim at one point very reactively turned around and just instructed Alejandro Garnacho and Mason Mount to warm up. Normally the substitutes warm up in batches of 4s, really. On this occasion, it was just those two, which indicated that if things were going to continue, it felt like he was going to make a double substitution at half time. And I've never seen, certainly it's early days still, but I've never seen Amorim that animated or exasperated in the technical area. But then between minutes 34 and minutes 64, United scored 4 goals to kill the game. And the game was really over and done with by half time, even though there's that cliche of 2-0 is a dangerous scoreline. But just looking at the body language of the Everton players, and in particular Jared Branthwaite as he skulked off for the interval, they knew that they were done at that point. And I think we said at the time that, United will probably run away with this now. And they did run away with it without really having to do much running. As I said, the scoring was all done and dusted by the 64th minute. And roughly the last half an hour, it was a non-event. It was relaxing for United. They could make substitutions with the Arsenal game in mind on Wednesday, rest some players, allow some players to start their recovery early on, and look ahead to that game. And the Stretford end was in good voice, a very, in a celebratory voice, because it's rare that they've seen United have such a dominant win in a more meaningful game, I think it's safe to say, rather than just a League Cup game against Barnsley. So it's still early days. And I think the fact that Amorim said afterwards that he said to 5 Live, I think it was, that the scoreline wasn't particularly reflective of the way the game went. And certainly Everton fans in the first half an hour sounded very bullish to our right. By long before the end of the game, their end was half empty. And I think a lot of, I suspect the majority who were at Old Trafford yesterday will not want to see Sean Dyche in charge beyond the end of this season. Maybe get rid of him before then. But it was, from United's perspective, it's very encouraging to see them perform quite clinically and have one of those days that really, for those of us who can remember, it was a little bit of a throwback to the glory days where they would have games won in the tunnel before kickoff.
It almost reminded me a little bit in terms of a convincing league win of the 3-0 win over West Ham back in February when United got the job done without too much fuss. Of course, Ahmad was the star of the show, getting 2 assists either side of half-time. On an afternoon of 2s, really, Joshua Zirkzee getting a couple of goals, Rashford a couple of goals, couple of assists for Fernandes as well. Samuel, you've done a piece on Ahmad this morning. He's fast becoming the star of the show at the moment, isn't he? He's on another level to many of his teammates. He's looking very fresh and very vibrant in this wing-back role.
I thought he would be suited to it before he came in. He's just got the intensity, he's got the speed, he's got the selflessness, and you want that balance of not having 2 fullbacks in those wide roles, because you don't want it to be too defensive minded, you don't want it to be too gung-ho. And I thought he always had scope to really slot in either on the left or the right. Of course, he's been developed at Atalanta, at United, at Sunderland as well, fleetingly at Rangers as more of a right-sided player. And so it was perfectly logical to play him there. And he's done really, really well. He did well under Van Nistelrooy. I think he had some decent moments under Ten Hag this season as well, but Ten Hag never really truly fancied him. There was always some scepticism about Ten Hag. I mean, I know for a fact that Ten Hag just had no intention of playing him in the Coventry FA Cup semi-final, bringing him on as a substitute, unless Marcus Rashford had got injured, so his hand was forced that day, which was quite peculiar because by that point, Ahmad had established himself as something of a game-changing substitute. He always tended to make things happen when he would come on in games. And the fact that he tended to come on in games when United were either losing or drawing spoke volumes as well. And he did pretty well in those cameos. But I'm really pleased for him because amazingly, he's been at United for nearly 4.5 years, but it feels now that he's only just starting to get going. He's started matches under 5 different managers, which is pretty extraordinary. And of course, a lot of teammates have done that as well. But in his first few years at the club, he only had 3 starts, and they were not meaningful starts. They were in heavily rotated teams. His first one was against Leicester because they were playing 2 days later against Liverpool, which was postponed through the fan protests for the Super League. He started on the final day of that season against Wolves because United had the Europa League final a few days later. And then I think he started under Ralf Rangnick in Champions League Dead Rubber, which was in December 2021 against Young Boys. And then he didn't start again for United until Arsenal in May of this year. And that first start came along nearly 5 months after he recovered from an ankle injury. So that just shows you how sceptical Ten Hag was of him and unsure he was of starting him. But I've always looked at him and I've watched him at Leeds Sports Village at under 21 level, and of course I've watched some of his games on the telly against for Sunderland, and pretty much been there for every game he's played for United, or certainly the majority of them. And he's always had something about him. And I go back to earlier in the season when United beat Southampton 3-0 back in September, I think it was. And United, a bit like at the weekend, United in that game were not playing well in the first half an hour. In fact, that really doesn't quite tell the story. They were pretty poor and they were let off the hook by Cameron Archer's missed penalty. But there was a moment in that game where it was at 0-0, and Ahmad was probably the only one who was playing well at 0-0, and he was up against Leslie. I think I'm trying to pronounce his name now. Ugo Chukwu, I think it might be Leslie Ugochukwu. I'm never going to get that right. But he was in a 50-50. He was in a 50-50 duel with him, and he used his body brilliantly to not just win the physical duel, but keep the ball and then play. It might have been Fernandez on the far side, have the vision to play the pass, and he did all that in a matter of seconds. And I thought watching that there, I mean, the fact that he did that at 0-0 when United weren't playing well was a good sign. But it also showed that physically he's a lot more robust, and certainly playing in the wing-back role or one of these wide roles, you've got to be physically robust. And there will be times where he'll make some mistakes. He got caught out for Liam Delap's chance in the first half at Ipswich, but he's certainly got the ability to play in that role in the long term. And I think he's such a good footballer that he could easily be one of the two behind the striker. And I'm pleased, really, that Amorim has reneged on that early pledge before the first game when he suggested that it would be fullbacks playing in the wide roles, which I didn't entirely agree with, just for what I said a couple of minutes earlier, that you don't want to be too defensive minded. I think the back three system has evolved a lot in that yesteryear, and people may have looked at it and thought it's quite negative. That, I mean, certainly watching the Netherlands at the 2014 World Cup, it did feel like they had 7 defensive-minded players behind Wesley Sneijder, Ian Robin, and Robin van Persie, which isn't a bad 3 to depend on for goals. And they did score a fair few goals in that tournament. But they were a very, very pragmatic team, and they became more pragmatic as the tournament progressed as well. In the knockouts, they won 1 game via a penalty from Klaas-Jan Huntelaar against Costa Rica. They won on a penalty shootout in the quarterfinals. In the semi-finals, they lost a penalty shootout to Argentina. The quarterfinals and the semi-finals, they both ended 0-0. And that's because the pragmatism kind of caught up with them, where they were too weighted in the defensive side of things. And Van Gaal tried to replicate it at United, and it just didn't work. 1, because he didn't have the players. 2, because it was Premier League football and it was played over 9 months rather than a month in the case of a major tournament. But back threes, as you've seen with Sporting, you can make them attack minded, and I certainly think it's better to have 5 forward-thinking players and 5 defensive players rather than have it weighted in one way or the other. And although the Netherlands had a good World Cup in 2014, and it was a means to an end, it was classic tournament football where the ends justified the means, and it almost took them to the final as well. It's very different doing it over 9 months, and Amorim is still having to make tweaks to try and master that formation, but the depleted state of the central defence has worked in his favour, because it meant he had to play Masraoui as a centre back against Ipswich rather than as the right winger and Dalot as a left winger, and it meant that he had to play Ahmad, and maybe he would have played Ahmad as one of the two behind Marcus Rashford that day, but I suspected it would always be Garnacho and Fernandes, and it's worked out really well. It is still, of course, early days, but with Ahmad, his contract's up at the end of the season. They've got the option of a +1, but they need to be extending his contract now if they haven't already. The question has been asked, and then they need to get him on a long-term contract, because he's a player who should be pretty integral for United in the coming years.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more, Samuel, to be quite honest. And as you know, I'm a bit of a Championship fanatic. I watched a lot of him when he was at Sunderland, and the signs were there. And you look at his statistics from yesterday's game, it was obviously 2 assists to highlight, but 3 key passes, won 4 tackles as well, won 11 ground duels. It shows the selflessness that you mentioned and the willingness to work for the team. And what was quite surprising for me when I was looking at the stats this morning, only Mohamed Salah, Cole Palmer and Bukayo Saka have now got more assists than Ahmad in the Premier League. So it shows that he is getting better and better. But obviously, Ahmad was a key part of the win. So too were Marcus Rashford and Joshua Zirkzee, 2 goals apiece for them. Zirkzee was quite a surprise inclusion in the 11. We both felt when the team news was announced 75 minutes before kickoff. However, he took his chance, took both of his goals pretty well, I thought. The first one I certainly thought was a harder finish than it probably first looked with the covering defenders. But he made his mark on the game, and Ruben Amorim was pretty pleased with his contribution.
Well, it bodes well that 3 different strikers have started in 3 different games and they've all scored. Rashford, of course, got 1 against Ipswich. Hoyland got 2 against Bodo Glimt, and then Zirkzee getting 2. Yes, and I agree with what you say about the first goal. I think Fernandes actually copped up the pass. I think he may have been trying to play it to Ahmad, but he overhit it quite badly. And Zirkzee, in fairness to him, as soon as Ahmad won the ball, he was bursting into the penalty area, which was a criticism of him against Ipswich. He wasn't getting into the area quickly enough when he came on, and he has to slide in, and then he has to divert the ball past someone on the line. And I think Ashley Young was trying to catch up with him as well. So it was actually a lot more difficult than it appeared. It certainly wasn't an easy finish. The second goal he took very coolly, and we've seen that so often. When a striker gets a first goal in God knows how long, the second one comes so naturally to them, their body language looks completely different, and he did look a different player. I think in a strange way, maybe the most impressive contribution from him, it wasn't either of the 2 goals, but it was the pass for the third goal when he played Ahmad on his way. I think that is the player United probably hoped they were getting from in Zirkzee, because we know that he likes to drop off, and he was doing that quite a lot early on yesterday. But that pass for Ahmad was visionary. It was a terrific pass. It accelerated the attack. It played him into space. It made the third goal possible. And that, there were a couple of instances yesterday. I mean, Ahmad's contribution for the second goal, where although a player wasn't getting the assist or the goal, the bulk of the credit, in a way, had to go to the player. I think they call it a pre-assist or some nonsense like that. But Zirkzee, certainly for that third goal, did brilliantly. And when a striker scores 2 goals and the team wins 4-0, it is always a very, very good day. And it was a particularly good day for him because it was his first start in the league in 9 weeks. I suspect there would have been very few inside Old Trafford who would have approved of seeing him in the starting 11, just because of how his season has gone. I certainly thought that Hoyland would be back on the bench, just because Amorim had said in midweek that he was dead after the Bodo Glimt game. It is a tight turnaround, playing a game. What would it have been? Something like 60 64 hours later, and Amorim had said on the Thursday night that they would essentially be playing walking football or jogging through training drills. So he's trying to master the rotation so players are fresh and not running players into the ground. I thought Højlund would be back on the bench, and I thought Garnacho would be on the bench as well, because he'd pretty much completed 2 matches in Amorim's first 2 games in charge. But it was still a pretty risky call to go with someone who hadn't scored since the opening day of the season, all the way back in August, more than 3 months ago. And looking at the 2 strikers who started yesterday, Beto he's ungainly, he's chaotic, and he doesn't score goals. But his only goal this season was against Fulham in the Premier League. Xerxes' only goal in the Premier League this season was against Fulham. And it kind of sometimes it writes itself. But Beto had, I think I'd say, he had 2 very good openings. One where he should have played Decore, and when he was onside, he failed, and then he endangered spectators. The second one was trickier, but given that he got the ball past Onana and De Ligt at 0-0, you think, well, he possibly should hit the target, but it went the wrong side of the post. And Xerxes, when he did have his chances, he took them. And also he created a good opportunity for Ahmad at 0-0. And again, that was through dropping off. And I think his style will always, unless he's playing like that every week for Amorim, I think his style will jar with Amorim's, because Amorim does want a striker to stay high up. He wants the striker to be serviced. And Xerxes, because he's been described as a 9.5, it's a very different way of playing. It's not like for like. To go from Højlund to Xerxes, it's to go from 2 different, completely different styles of striker. And with yesterday, the ends did justify the means, but there were signs in that first half an hour where you saw the issues with it, where Xerxes drops off so much. There are at least 2 occasions where Amorim was extremely peeved, to say the least, that he wasn't in a position to press. And pressing is a big part of this United's game, and I don't think Amorim is going to compromise on that at all. So long term, it's going to have to be someone who is more in the Højlund mould, who is going to be a workaholic, who is going to stay high up on the pitch, rather than someone like Xerxes, who has this laconic way about him and does like to drop off. But he had a good game yesterday. As I said, he was very good dropping off. Certainly in the early stages, avoiding the duels with Branthwaite or Tarkowski seemed a pretty sensible strategy, although Branthwaite actually started very well in the first, up until he deflected the ball past Jordan Pickford. He was having a very good game, and then a brainstorm later, and he just went to pot. So it'll be interesting to see whether United can master that, going from one different style in Højlund to another different style in Xerxes. 2 games per week, is that sustainable? I suspect not. As I said, I think that victory yesterday, as clinical as United were with some of their chances, it was pretty much gifted to them by Everton as well.
Yeah, definitely. There was moments that Everton obviously could have taken the lead in the game, and obviously Marcus Rashford, he got a couple of goals as well. That's 3 in 2 league games under Ruben Amorim for him. We've said it so many times about Marcus Rashford, of course, about is this the beginning of him getting back to his best? 10 direct goal contribution this season now. Only got 13 in the whole of last season, so he's almost matched that. It's a step in the right direction. But we know a fit and firing Marcus Rashford, as we saw in 2022-23, can be a very, very good Marcus Rashford. So rotation, probably a key element of what Ruben Amorim is going to do in the coming weeks, but you'd probably expect to see him keep his place at Arsenal, Rashford.
I would imagine so, and probably, as given how it went yesterday, I think maybe as one of the 2 behind the striker, and possibly Højlund comes back in. Amorim has said himself that the striker position is not Rashford's best, so I don't think that is going to be where he plays long term if he is to remain at United. And it worked out better for him yesterday, although the 2 goals, very different goals. I think the positioning wasn't a huge factor in it. The first goal, of course, Everton are caught sleeping, where they somehow leave him unattended. He caught it very sweetly on the half volley, and Branthwaite ensures that it is a goal. The second goal was more reminiscent of the Rashford of 22-23, in that he knew exactly what run to make, timed it perfectly. Tarkowski was pretty charitable, failing to keep up with him. And I think sometimes Rashford, if he has time to think, that's when he's at his weakest. he knew exactly what to do with the ball yesterday. It was just first time, hit it, and okay, it does go in off Pickford, but it's still good forward play. Dare I say, strikers play if he is to go back up front against Arsenal. But we've talked about it ad nauseum in terms of his ability when he is on it, and I think it does help that Amorim has kind of, he's certainly given him a little jolt here and there, put him on the bench in midweek, although that was for rotation purposes, saying that he has to want it as well because everyone has seen Rashford's body language and knows how certainly disconsolate he can look at times, and supporters have not been shy in expressing their anger with that or their frustration. It happened very frequently last season, and I suppose the acid test for him will be this December, with the games coming thick and fast, and whether he can sustain the start that he's had under Amorim. Because as I said before the Ipswich game, if there is one player under a new manager who tends to perform, it is Rashford, and he's done it pretty much under every manager apart from Ralph Rangnick, and Amorim is that has continued under Amorim so far. It helps that the formation does intensify the competition, where it's those. I know it's a front three, as it is a front three with other, with a lot of other teams, but obviously Fernandes is always going to be in one of those positions, and previously he would be outside of the front three, so it does reduce. It does intensify the competition. Mason Mount, Amorim has taken a shine to, and I can see why, because of how hard he works off the ball. He did decently against Bodo Glimt. He's played in a back three formation for Chelsea and for England, and he's done it in some huge games such as a Champions League final and a European Championship final. So it helps that there's competition, and it helps that it's more intense, because it will weed out those who are in it for the long haul and those who won't be in it for the long haul. And we're already starting to see signs of those who probably will be sticking around under Amorim next season.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to sort of zoom out of individuals and focus on the collective nature of that result yesterday, since in my findings for this podcast, I actually discovered since the 3-0 defeat to Tottenham at the end of September, 6 wins in 7 home games for United since then, with 1 draw, that being against Chelsea, 20 goals scored to 6 conceded. The home form's been gradually improving after the Spurs game felt it was where United did hit rock bottom. And as well as that, another clean sheet as well yesterday. So there is a lot for Amorim to build on, obviously from what Ruud van Nistelrooy did in his interim charge, but the home form has been up and down for United in the last 12 months. And if they can get this right, it's certainly going to boost their chances of making an assault on the top 4, you think?
They've always got to try and have Old Trafford as a fortress, but we know it's not been like that for a very long time. They've had seasons in the past where they've been unbeaten at home. They've had seasons in the past where they've dropped 2 points at home in the entirety of the campaign in the Premier League, and they have started to score more goals. I mean, amazingly, they have a better goal difference than Manchester City now, which I never thought I'd see the day, certainly as far as this season was concerned. But they, that is the case rather staggeringly. And United could have piled more misery on Everton yesterday, but playing the long game, the bigger picture, big game on Wednesday, ensuring that players are rested, that took precedence, and that's why the scoring stopped after the 64th minute. But they're certainly, I think it was refreshing to hear the supporters as buoyant as they were yesterday, because that wasn't the case at the start of the season. That level of expectation had really nosedived because of what happened last season. And as optimistic as supporters are on the first day back in August, that hope evaporated quite quickly, with Liverpool putting 3 past United a couple of weeks after they'd beaten Fulham at home, and then a month later, or in the same month, in fact, Tottenham did exactly the same thing. So to go from 2 3-0 defeats to a couple of borderline handsome wins in the Premier League, 1-3-0 against Ipswich, 1-4-0 against Everton. That is a huge sign of progress, and they've just got to ensure that these results aren't the exception to the norm, and that they do continue to build on them. They'll have a more difficult game at home on Saturday against Nottingham Forest, who are having a surprisingly good season. And as I said, the sterner tests are to come, and that's why nobody's getting carried away with it. And Amorim certainly isn't getting carried away with it. He's a very measured personality, and he talks very considerate with great consideration as well. So yeah, it's early days, but I think there's certainly a spring in the step of those who walk down the Warwick Road.
Most definitely. And that does conclude part 1 of this episode of the Manchester is Red podcast. Do rejoin us in part 2 in a moment's time, where we'll look ahead to Wednesday night's trip to Arsenal. Welcome back to the latest episode of the Manchester is Red podcast. Myself and Samuel looking now ahead to Wednesday night's trip to the Emirates Stadium to face Arsenal. And as Samuel mentioned a moment or two ago about sterner tests lying ahead for Manchester United, this is, with no disrespect to Ipswich, Bodo Glimt and Everton, without doubt the sternest test that Ruben Amorim will have faced since taking the job at Old Trafford. Arsenal away, Samuel, there's obviously a lot of history between these two clubs. It's one of the big ones that everybody looks out for on the calendar. And it's going to take something special, you'd imagine, for United to get something from this, because Arsenal just beginning to peak a little bit again.
And they've got a really bad record at the Emirates Stadium in recent years. They've not won in the Premier League there since December 2017. Their last win there was when Ole Gunnar Solskjaer was still caretaker manager. That was in the FA Cup 4th round in January 2019. So quietly, they've gone quite some time without getting a result there. And last season, I thought they did okay, and it was a horrible game to write, that one, given what happened at the end with Garnacho seemingly scoring a winning goal in added time. Then it's chalked off, and then it's probably the best example I've seen of the momentum swing of VAR, in that United think they were about to win a game 2-1. The goal's chalked off. Arsenal end up winning the game 3-1 by scoring a couple of goals within the next five minutes or so, whatever it was. And that game really set the tone for United's season last season, in that they went ahead but conceded quickly after scoring, as they had done the previous season at the Emirates as well. They conceded an added time goal, which obviously became an unwanted habit last season. Fulham got an added time winner, Chelsea got an added time winner, and also defenders started dropping like flies that day. Martinez came off injured, Lindelof came off injured. They ended the game with Johnny Evans and Harry Maguire in defence, and Harry Maguire got cat calls when he came on. It was at that point where his approval ratings were pretty low among United fans, never mind opposition fans. And of course, after that game, I made the mistake of asking Ten Hag where Jadon Sancho was. And he said that he was in the squad due to training form. And of course, less than an hour later, when Rich Fay and I are on the train going back, Sancho decides to put his post up on Twitter, and then a potentially quiet international break becomes a very busy and loud one for those of my colleagues who were working it. I wasn't working it. I was quite glad not to be in the end. But Arsenal are just, since United last won there, Arsenal are just a very, very different team. I mean, they are a serious side, and they have been for a couple of years now. The job Arteta has done there, without, I mean, he has won something, but it was quite a while ago now, 4.5 years that they won the FA Cup. And it was, unfortunately for them, it was one of those soulless FA Cup wins because it was during the COVID-19 pandemic, but it is still a trophy. But the progress they've made in the Premier League has been, I didn't think it would come along that quickly. And certainly under Ten Hag, there was a hope that United could mirror the progress that Arteta had made under Arsenal, and that maybe things had to get worse before they'd get better. In the end, the comparison just didn't stack up in the end, and Ten Hag is no longer the United manager, of course. But I always thought Arteta was a very good fit for Arsenal, given the club they were at and the state they were in when Arsene Wenger left in 2018. I always thought Unai Emery was not a good fit for Arsenal. There's a reason why Emery has done well at Sevilla, Villarreal, and Aston Villa. They are said Villa then, almost as if they were a Spanish club as well. But those clubs, when they're when they're outside the elite, that's where Emery does his best work. And Arsenal are an elite club. They have been for decades. They're one of the biggest clubs in England, and that was never going to change just because they'd had a fallow period, certainly as far as Premier League titles was concerned. But Arteta was the right man at the right time. And they'll probably be kicking themselves that they had that slump in form earlier in the season where they lost some points, crucial points against Bournemouth, against Newcastle, because Manchester City have been gifting. Look at City, the state they're in. They're not even third at the moment, and they're only 4 points ahead of United's. But it does look like where Arsenal, that they seem to make a hell of a lot of noise about injuries, as if no other club has injuries to contend with. And yeah, if you're missing key players, it's bound to have a detrimental impact on your form. But you've got to cope with that. And Arsenal weren't coping very well with it until, of course, Martin Odegaard regained fitness. And I wasn't sure he would be such an influential player for them, but he's one of the best players in the Premier League. I know he was almost becoming a journeyman with all those loans at Real Madrid, but it was very good business by Arsenal to sign him, and he's a huge player for them. So it's difficult to be really upbeat about United's chances, because they are going to one of the best teams in the league, one of the best teams in Europe possibly, and certainly at home. Arsenal, I think the Emirates Stadium, it's not an atmospheric stadium whatsoever, despite the measures they've taken, some of them quite cringing, like that North London Forever thing that they play before games. But it doesn't matter almost, because the players are excellent. Saka, Odegaard, Havertz has become a brilliant player, I think, at Arsenal. Again, really good recruitment. They've got a really solid spine there. David Raya has become a better goalkeeper this season. I think he's become much more dependable in terms of actually keeping the ball out of the net. I didn't think that was always one of his strengths. They are a very good example of how you can progress with good recruitment, and they've got it right more often than not in the past 3 or 4 years. So if United were to get a draw there, I think that would be pretty good going. And United have got their own challenges going there now, with 2 suspensions after Kobbie Mainoo and Lisandro Martinez were both booked, both completely correct, those bookings as well. They were both cynical tug backs, and when a player does that, you do wonder if they're aware that they're a match away from suspension. And in the case of Mainoo, I think it's forgivable that it might have slipped his mind because he hadn't played in so long. It was his first start in 8 weeks. Martinez less so. He has been back in the fold recently. He did play in midweek, but I mean, because the game wasn't televised, I think that was where we were handicapped in the press box, because nobody was mentioning that, oh, they're suspended. It just slipped our minds. And normally, of course, if the game's being televised in the UK, it will flash up with their name and say misses next match. But I think maybe we got carried away with the positivity of United thumping Everton 4-0, but it did slip my mind, or I certainly wasn't aware that they were both a game away from suspension. So going into that game on Wednesday, you would think this has to be the game that Luke Shaw comes in on the left side at centre-back. And although United could only have 2 centre-backs to pick from again, and Harry Maguire maybe on the bench, I think a lot of people would be quite comfortable with it, because Shaw has got form of playing well at centre-back. This new formation, it does give him another lifeline. I think there are a lot of United fans who certainly have lost patience with him because of the amount of injuries he's had, and the fact in particular that he went away and played for England, came back to United, got injured, and was out for another 3 months. And only recently he made his comeback for United. It was his first game in 9 months. But this formation, it does, whether he's playing on the left wing or playing as one of the centre-backs, he has got options there. And I've no doubt that he'll have to come into the team in the week. And Amorim must have known that as well when he gave him another run out yesterday. It was more meaningful minutes. The midfield is tricky, though, because it's going to have to be, unless you're moving Fernandes back there, which I think has to be considered, it's going to be 3 of Casemiro, Ugarte and Eriksen. And up against that Arsenal trio of, it'll probably, I know Jorginho played at the weekend, so maybe Partey's an injury doubt. But if it's Odegaard, Rice, and Jorginho, even with Jorginho, it's the superior midfield trio, and it'll be tricky for United to navigate that. But of course, United are playing a different way now, and how they counter that intensity there, and particularly Odegaard. Normally, I think if it's like for like, if it's 4-2-3-1 versus 4-2-3-1, it's easier to put someone on the playmaker and try and shadow them throughout the game. What United have in store for Odegaard on Wednesday night will be pretty fascinating to see what they come up with.
Yeah, and I was actually going to ask you, Samuel, about the midfield changes that are going to happen as a result of Manu's suspension. You would like to think, with Arsenal obviously going into this one as favourites, the onus is going to be on them to get the 3 points. You'd expect Casemiro and Manuel Ugarte, you would probably imagine both of them to start at the very least, just to give that grit and determination in the midfield. But I fully agree with you on Luke Shaw. I think it's a logical solution. Left-footed, left-sided centre-half, not as much running involved in that area as in the wing-back role. So it does feel like Ruben Amorim has got quite an easy decision to make to replace Martinez. And like you quite rightly said, it feels like Luke Shaw's been given a lifeline with a second role to play, if you like.
Yeah, and with the greatest of respect to Martinez, him being out injured is not the blow that it was last season when he got injured against West Ham or couldn't continue after the Bayern Munich game, or when he had to come off against Sevilla that time. His form has not been good this season, and they have got a ready-made replacement now. And I know Luke Shaw is a left-back by trade, but he's played an awful lot at centre-back in a two and a trio, and he's done very well there. I'd say he probably played better in a defensive two when he was playing on the left side. I still remember in the FA Cup semi-final against Brighton, he was excellent, and it was a time where I think his main partner might have been Victor Lindelof, and Lindelof was playing really well at the time. So it just goes to show when you have to come in and needs must, how motivated a player can G themselves up, and they perform at such a high level. And Shaw does owe United as well, where he, as I said, he hadn't played for 9 months. He'd gone away and played for England at the European Championship, starting in a semi-final, starting in a final, coming back to United, getting injured, being out for another 3 months. He does owe United some performances, and also this is how long he's been at United. I remember when he first played at Arsenal there under Louis van Gaal as a 19-year-old, United did play a back three. And Shaw was, unsurprisingly, back then, he was not one of the three centre-halves. I mean, it's not a bad quiz question if anyone can get it. 3 centre-halves that day were Tyler Blackett, Paddy McNair and Chris Smalling. Shaw was on the left, and Shaw came off injured in the first half. So that will be something he will not be wanting to repeat on Wednesday night. United actually somehow won that game as well that day. It was this is how rare wins have become at Arsenal as well. I think post-Ferguson, they've only won there twice in the Premier League. So they used to have a pretty good record going there. A couple of 3-1 wins, scoring some memorable counter-attacking goals as well. But the wins have dried up at the Emirates in the past decade. But Shaw does actually have experience of playing for United at Arsenal when they adopted a back three system. The difference on that occasion being that he was on the wing, and his evening didn't last very long at all. But United did somehow win that game 2-1, amazingly, more than a decade ago now.
Amorim has obviously made no secret of the need to rotate. He said in his pre-match interview yesterday that it was impossible to go with the same 11 that starts on Thursday night, which is more than fair enough due to the tight turnaround. We've seen 6 changes from game to game so far. We're going to see at least 2 on Wednesday night with the enforced suspensions. We've mentioned there, Samuel, about defensive combinations in midfield. The attack, obviously, the question is Rasmus Højlund going to come back in? Will immediately taking Joshua Zirkzee out after scoring 2 dent his confidence? Could Mason Mount be an option as one of the number 10s? As problematic as it can be to predict these 11s, it's really good that Ruben Amorim has got so many options in every department with the injury list now so short, really.
It is, and it is extremely difficult to predict what his team will be. Obviously, we do our panel teams before games, which are personal 11s. They're not us predicting what the team is going to be. But if you were to do a predict panel as well, I don't think any of us would have got anywhere near the 11s that he's selected so far. I think in terms of, I think I did try and guess the team in the blog for the Ipswich game, and I think I got 8 out of 11 or something like that. But he has thrown a few curveballs in there at times, and I think he'll have to be more conventional against Arsenal. But as you said, there is intense competition where the strikers have all been scoring in their games, but only one of them can start in that role. He could accommodate Rashford as well as Højlund, and I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, I think Højlund's pressing is going to be very important. And when he made his debut at Arsenal last season, he did unnerve Gabriel and Saliba. He could easily have got a penalty on another day. He did very well in the build-up for that goal that was chalked off for Garnacho with the back heel. He provided a presence that Anthony Marshall just didn't offer. Marshall was more often than not the invisible man when he was playing in games in his final years at United. And Højlund is a workaholic. There are a lot of kinks to iron out in his game, but he does put himself about. He does run into the ground. Amorim said after the Bodo game that he was dead through all his running, which indicates that he was never ever going to start against Everton. Come the game on Wednesday, he'll have had a 6-day breather because he didn't even come on yesterday against Everton. After the game, when we went down, a couple of us went down to the mix zone, and Højlund was doing sprints with Tyrone Marshall. Harry Maguire and Alejandro Garnacho had also re-emerged for a warm down. We went in to chat to Xerxes, came out 10 minutes later, and Højlund and Marshall were still embarking on their sprints, having not played any part in the game. So, can you read too much into that? Probably, because I don't think Marshall should be starting on Wednesday night, and I don't think he will be starting. But Højlund, there is a case for him to come back into the team. And of course, where Amorim has said that Rashford's best role is not as a striker, does he continue with Rashford as one of the two behind the striker, which logically would be Højlund? I don't think Xerxes should start. He did very well yesterday, but Sir Alex Ferguson mastered rotating strikers 25 years ago, longer than that even, and there's no reason why you can't do it now. And Xerxes will get his fair share of games in December and beyond, possibly as well, depending on his future. But I think because of Højlund's presence and because he's had that gap in between, and sometimes, I mean, Ferguson again was a master of this, of picking teams weeks in advance. And we're not talking about weeks here, we're talking about days. And if Højlund has been told on the quiet that he's going to be starting against Arsenal and he's got to prepare from yesterday or today, that's a confidence booster for him, and that gives him ample time to really prime himself and be in the best nick possible to be as much of a nuisance as possible against probably the best central defensive partnership in the league.
Yeah, ultimately we will obviously see what happens. It is interesting. It is hard for us to predict, as you've quite rightly said, Simon. But just to wrap this podcast up before we take up too much of people's time, just wanted to look at the record that United have away against the traditional members of the Big Six since the start of the 2022-23 season, which was obviously the beginning of the Erik ten Hag era. 10 away games in that time in the Premier League, 3 draws, 7 defeats, 0 wins, with 31 goals conceded. Obviously, Amorim in the next few weeks is going to be taking United to Arsenal, to City and to Spurs in the League Cup as well, just before Christmas. This is going to be a real test for him. And if he can sort of put down a marker in these games, it might just add another string to his bow.
It would certainly fuel confidence and belief that these early wins are not the exception to the norm. And irrespective of what happens this season, he's going to get the summer. Unless he takes United down to the Championship, which I somehow think he won't do. But he's going to have the summer to finesse things, to really stamp his identity on that squad, and he is doing that already. And you've got to embrace these challenges, because if you fear them, then you shouldn't be involved in it. And I don't think he'll fear it as well. He's had some success going to the Emirates, of course, with Sporting when they knocked Arsenal out of the Europa League at the round of 16 stage, I think it might have been, in 2023. I seem to remember some of us, we'd had the good fortune of covering United's easy win against Real Betis, having been 4-1 up from the first leg. as an early kickoff, and we got back to our hotel and we watched the penalty shootout between Sporting and Arsenal. I think it was on my mobile phone, and we could hear United fans in the distance cheering when Sporting won that penalty shootout. So Amorim does have that experience, at least, of going to the Emirates, and that Arsenal team is not too different from this Arsenal team. This Arsenal team has improved; it's better, but Arsenal were on the up at that time then as well. They were going hammer and tong at it for the Premier League title with Manchester City towards the end of that 22-23 season. And as you said, they've got huge away games coming up after that in the domestic competitions, and the City one will be fascinating because of City's form recently. The Tottenham one's a much bigger one than I think some people will give it credit for, because it's a quarter-final, and you look at the lineup in the League Cup, and it's a pretty intense, a pretty intense lineup of 8 sides, and you look at the identity of some of the clubs and some of the coaches, and they could really do with winning the League Cup when it's the final in February or March. So it's not necessarily been a gentle start as such, because Ipswich were well worth their draw last 8 days ago, whenever it was, and Bordeaux I thought were always going to be quite awkward opponents. Everton, it turned out, were more adventurous than I thought they would be, and I didn't think United would necessarily win by the margin that they did. But it's always going to get tougher at this time of year, because there is a lot of football in December, and I mean, we love it because it's there's lots to get stuck into, and I think Christmas time is particularly cherished in a lot of households because of the amount of football there is to watch as well. And it is the cliched survival of the fittest, and that's why Amorim has started to rotate as drastically as he has between games. But he is going to have to, I think, minimise it in the upcoming weeks, purely because of the calibre of opposition.
Absolutely. Well, 1 game down in December, 8 to go. It's going to be a fixture marathon in the coming weeks, that's for sure. It is going to be a survival of the fittest, as Samuel's quite rightly said. And that does bring an end to this episode of the Manchester is Red podcast. A big thank you to those of you who've tuned in to listen to myself and Samuel, to look back on the win over Everton and look ahead to Wednesday night's trip to Arsenal. We'll be back again later in the week to recap the game at the Emirates and look ahead to the weekend's clash with Forest. So we'll catch you again later in the week, and take care and have a good week.